The office was a tomb of flickering fluorescent lights, the kind that made your eyes ache after hours of staring at spreadsheets. Ethan Carter, 27, sat hunched over his desk, the city's skyline bleeding orange through the window as dusk settled over Chicago. He was alone until the door clicked shut, and the lock snapped with a sound that felt like a guillotine. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The air shifted, heavy with something unspoken, as his boss, Julian Hayes, leaned against the doorframe. Julian was 29, all sharp cheekbones and quiet intensity, his tailored suit a stark contrast to Ethan's rumpled shirt. They'd worked late before, but tonight felt different, electric, dangerous, like a storm about to break. "Ethan," Julian said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We need to talk." Ethan's heart thudded. He'd spent months burying his feelings for Julian, convincing himself the lingering glances and late-night conversations were nothing more than professional camaraderie. Julian was his boss. After all, a man who commanded boardrooms with a single look, who seemed untouchable. But now, with the door locked and the office eerily silent, Ethan felt the walls closing in. He pushed back his chair, standing to meet Julian's gaze. "About what?" His voice cracked, betraying the nerves he tried to hide. Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, his steps deliberate, until he was close enough for Ethan to catch the faint scent of his colonoscopy wood and something warmer, like amber. "It's about us," Julian said, and the word "us" hit Ethan like a freight train. He wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was a joke, but Julian's eyes held no humor. They were raw, unguarded, and for the first time, Ethan saw something he hadn't dared to name: desire. The office, once a place of deadlines and coffee runs, transformed into a battleground of unspoken truths. Ethan had grown up in a small Illinois town where being gay was a secret you buried deep, where his father's belt and his mother's silence taught him to hide who he was. He'd moved to Chicago to escape, to build a life where he could breathe. But even here, in a city that promised freedom, he kept his heart locked away, especially from men like Julian, men who seemed too perfect, too dangerous to trust. Julian, though, wasn't what he seemed. Ethan had heard the rumors. Julian's family, old money Chicago elites, expected him to marry a woman from their circle, to uphold the Hayes legacy. Yet here he was, standing too close, his breath uneven. "I've been trying to ignore this," Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't. Not anymore." Ethan's mind raced. Was this a trap? A test? He'd seen what happened to people who crossed lines at work, careers ruined, reputations shredded. But Julian's hand grazed his arm, and the touch sent a jolt through him, unraveling every defense he'd built. "What are you saying?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Julian stepped closer, their faces inches apart. "I'm saying I'm tired of pretending I don't want you." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, to push Julian away, to cling to the safety of denial. But his body betrayed him, leaning into the space between them, drawn to the heat of Julian's presence. The office, with its sterile desks and humming computers, faded away. All that remained was the pull between them, a force stronger than fear. Before Ethan could speak, Julian's lips were on his, tentative at first, then urgent. The kiss was a collision of need and restraint, years of repression breaking free. Ethan's hands found Julian's shoulders, gripping the fabric of his suit as if it were a lifeline. For a moment, nothing else mattered, not the locked door, not the consequences, not the world outside. But the world always finds a way back in. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. And Ethan pulled away, his chest heaving. Julian's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the chaos in his expression. "It's Sarah," came the muffled reply. Sarah, the HR manager, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Ethan's stomach dropped. If she suspected anything, if she'd heard rumors, this could end them both. Julian unlocked the door, his movements calm but deliberate. Sarah stepped inside, her gaze flicking between them. "Working late again?" she asked, her tone neutral but her eyes searching. Ethan nodded, unable to trust his voice. Julian, ever the professional, flashed a disarming smile. "Just wrapping up a project," he said smoothly. Sarah lingered a moment longer than necessary, then left with a curt nod. The door clicked shut again, but the spell was broken. Ethan's mind spiraled. What had they done? What did this mean? Julian turned to him, his expression a mix of determination and fear. "We need to figure this out," he said. "Not here. Not now. But soon." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know what this was: a mistake, a beginning, or something doomed to destroy them both. But as he gathered his things and left the office, the weight of Julian's kiss lingered, a promise and a warning all at once. The Chicago wind bit at Ethan's face as he stepped onto the street, the city's pulse thrumming under his feet. His lips still burned from Julian's kiss, a memory that felt both vivid and unreal, like a dream he couldn't shake. He pulled his coat tighter, trying to outrun the questions clawing at his mind. What did Julian want? What did he want? Back at his apartment, a cramped one-bedroom in Wicker Park, Ethan replayed the night. Julian's confession had cracked something open inside him, a longing he'd buried since he was a teenager, sneaking glances at boys in gym class, only to be met with his father's wrath when he was caught. He'd learned to hide, to blend in, to be the guy who never made waves. But Julian was a tidal wave, and Ethan was drowning. The next morning at the office, Ethan braced himself. Would Julian act like nothing happened? Would Sarah's suspicious glance turn into something more? He kept his head down, focusing on emails, but his eyes kept drifting to Julian's corner office. The glass walls offered no privacy, and Julian was already there, pristine in a navy suit, his face unreadable as he spoke on the phone. By noon, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He knocked on Julian's door, his heart in his throat. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Julian looked up, and for a split second, his mask slipped. Something raw and unguarded flickered in his eyes. "Close the door," Julian said, his tone neutral but his gaze intense. Ethan hesitated, the memory of last night's locked door flashing through his mind. He shut it gently, leaving it unlocked. "We can't just ignore this," Ethan said, his voice low. "What happened last night? What was that?" Julian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I meant what I said, Ethan. I've been fighting this for months. Every time we're in a room together." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to do this. My family, this job, the expectations. I've never let myself want this." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew what this meant: not just a kiss, but a life that defied everything they'd been taught to be. He thought of his own family, the way his mother had looked away when he tried to come out at 17, the way his father had called it a phase he'd grow out of. He'd grown out of nothing. He'd just learned to hide better. Then why now? Ethan asked. Why risk everything? Julian's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Because I saw you, Ethan. Really saw you. The way you work late without complaining. The way you listen when I'm losing it over a deadline. You're not just some guy in the office. You're you. The words hit harder than the kiss. Ethan wanted to believe them, to let himself fall into the possibility of us. But fear gnawed at him. And if someone finds out? Sarah was already looking at us like she knew something. Julian's jaw tightened. Sarah's loyal. But she's not stupid. We need to be careful. My family's got eyes everywhere. Me father's on the board. And he's not exactly open-minded. Ethan laughed bitterly. Yeah, I know the type. He paused, then asked the question that had kept him up all night. So what do we do? Pretend it never happened. Julian stood, rounding the desk to stand closer. I don't want to pretend, but we need time to figure this out. Meet me tonight. Not here. Somewhere we can talk. Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed. That evening, they met at a dive bar in Logan Square, far from the polished offices of downtown. The place was dim, crowded with locals nursing beers, the air thick with the smell of fried food. Julian looked out of place in his crisp shirt, but he blended in better than Ethan expected. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. They sat in a corner booth, their knees brushing under the table. Julian spoke first, his voice soft but urgent. I've never done this before. Not with a guy. Not with anyone who matters this much. Ethan's breath caught. Me neither. I mean, I've dated, but nothing serious. Nothing like. He gestured between them, unable to find the right word. Us. Julian finished, and the word felt like a vow. They talked for hours, peeling back layers of themselves. Julian admitted he'd known he was gay since college, but had buried it under family pressure and ambition. Ethan shared his own story, small-town shame. A move to Chicago. The constant fear of being found out. The bar faded away. And for the first time, Ethan felt seen. Not just as an employee or a son, but as himself. But reality crept in. Julian's phone buzzed with a text from his father, demanding a meeting about family obligations. Ethan saw the shift in Julian's expression, the weight of expectation settling back onto his shoulders. I have to go, Julian said, his voice heavy. But this isn't over. As Julian left, Ethan stayed, staring at his half-empty beer. He wanted to believe in the possibility of them, but the world outside the bar was crueler than their corner booth. He didn't know if they could survive either if he was brave enough to try. Ethan woke to the buzz of his phone. A text from Julian, meet me at the lakefront. 7 p.m. No explanation, just an address. His stomach churned with equal parts excitement and dread. Last night's conversation had left him raw, exposed, and he wasn't sure he could handle another round of hope laced with fear. The office that day was a minefield. Sarah lingered near Ethan's desk, asking pointed questions about a project he'd barely touched. Her eyes seemed to dissect him, searching for cracks. He kept his answers short, his focus on the clock. When 6:30 hit, he bolted. The lakefront, a 20-minute walk from the office. Lake Michigan stretched out like a dark mirror, reflecting the city's lights. Julian stood near the water, his coat flapping in the wind, his silhouette sharp against the fading sunset. Ethan approached, his heart hammering. You okay? He asked, noticing the tension in Julian's shoulders. Julian turned, his face etched with exhaustion. My father called me in today. He's pushing me to meet with Claire, some heiress he thinks I should marry. It's all part of the Hayes legacy bullshit. He spat the word like it burned. Ethan's chest tightened. What did you tell him? That I'm not interested. Julian's voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed the cost of that defiance. He didn't take it well. Said I'm throwing away everything he built. Ethan wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but the weight of Julian's words held him back. "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the waves. Julian looked at him, his gaze softening. "You. This. But it's not that simple. Ethan. My family's got power, money. Influence. If they find out about us, they'll make things hell." Ethan nodded, his own fears mirrored in Julian's words. He'd spent years hiding who he was. But standing here, with Julian's honesty laid bare, he felt a spark of courage. "Then we fight for it," he said, surprising himself. "We figure it out together." Julian's lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "Together," he echoed, and for a moment, the world felt less heavy. They walked along the lakefront, the cold biting at their fingers. Julian's hand brushed Ethan's, and neither pulled away. It wasn't a kiss, wasn't a confession, but it was enough to keep Ethan tethered to hope. They talked about everything and nothing: childhood dreams, favorite dive bars, the way Chicago felt alive at night. For an hour, they were just two guys. Not a boss and his employee. Not a secret waiting to be exposed. But the bubble burst when Julian's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, his face hardening. "It's my sister," he said, stepping away to answer. Ethan caught fragments of the conversation: sharp, tense words about family duty and disappointing dad. When Julian hung up, he looked drained, like the call had sucked the life out of him. "She knows something's up," Julian said, shoving his phone into his pocket. "She's not like my father, but she's loyal to the family. If she starts digging..." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What does she know?" "Not much. Yet." Julian's voice was grim. "But she's smart. She'll figure it out unless we're careful." They parted ways with a promise to meet again, to keep this fragile thing between them alive. Ethan walked home alone, the city's noise drowning out his thoughts. He wanted to believe they could make it work, but doubt gnawed at him. What if Julian's family found out? What if the office became a battlefield? He'd fought too hard for this life to lose it all. Back at his apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying Julian's smile, his touch, the way his voice softened when he said "together." But the memory of Sarah's gaze and Julian's family loomed larger, a storm cloud on the horizon. He didn't know how to navigate this, but for the first time, he wanted to try for Julian, for himself, for the chance at something real. The next day at work, Ethan noticed the shift. Colleagues whispered when he passed, their eyes lingering too long. Sarah called him into her office, her questions sharper now, circling around late nights and team dynamics. Ethan deflected, but his nerves frayed. He caught Julian's eye across the office, a silent question passing between them. "How long can we keep this up?" Ethan's coffee went cold on his desk, untouched, as he scanned the office for Julian. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. He hadn't slept, his mind tangled in last night's lakefront promises and the growing sense that their secret was unraveling. Julian was late, unusual for a man who ran on precision. When he finally arrived, his face was a mask of control, but Ethan caught the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands clenched briefly before relaxing. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but Sarah's presence loomed, her desk strategically positioned to watch the entire floor. Ethan buried himself in work, pretending not to notice the whispers that followed Julian's arrival. At lunch, Julian slipped him a note handwritten, a rarity in their digital world: "Meet me at the rooftop. 2 p.m." Ethan's pulse spiked. The rooftop was private, used mostly for client events, but it felt risky, exposed. Still, he went, driven by the need to understand Julian's silence. The rooftop was a concrete oasis, dotted with potted plants and a view of Chicago's jagged skyline. Julian stood at the edge, his back to Ethan, staring out at the city. My sister confronted me this morning, he said without turning. She saw us at the bar. Ethan's stomach dropped. What did you tell her? The truth. Part of it. Anyway. Julian faced him, his eyes tired but resolute. I told her I'm not marrying Claire. That I'm figuring things out. She didn't push, but she's suspicious. And she talks to my father. Ethan's mind raced. Julian's family wasn't just wealthy, they were connected. Powerful. The kind of people who could ruin careers with a phone call. What happens if they find out about us? He asked, his voice low. Julian stepped closer, his voice fierce. I won't let them hurt you. I promise. But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. Ethan wanted to believe him, but promises felt fragile against the weight of reality. They stood in silence, the city humming below. Ethan reached for Julian's hand, a small act of defiance against the fear creeping in. Julian squeezed back, his grip steady but brief. We need to be smarter, he said. No more late nights here. No more notes. Ethan nodded, but the words stung. Hiding felt like betrayal, a step back from the freedom they'd tasted. Still, he agreed, knowing the stakes. They parted with a glance, not a touch, and Ethan returned to his desk, his chest tight with unspoken words. The rest of the day was a blur of meetings and deadlines. But Sarah's scrutiny was relentless. She called Ethan into her office again, this time with a file labeled performance review. It was early for that, and her questions veered into personal territory as ours. His relationship with Julian. Ethan kept his answers vague, but her smile was too knowing, too sharp. That night, Ethan met Julian at a diner far from the office, a greasy spoon where no one would recognize them. Julian looked worn, his usual polish dulled by stress. My father's putting pressure on the board, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. He wants me to take a bigger role in the company. It's a test to see if I'll fall in line. And if you don't? Ethan asked, his voice barely steady. Julian's eyes met his, raw and unguarded. I lose everything. The job, the family, the life I've built. But I'd rather lose it all than lose you. The words hit Ethan like a punch. He wanted to reach across the table, to hold Julian and tell him they'd find a way. But fear held him back, not just of Julian's family, but of his own past, the scars of rejection that still ached. I don't want you to lose everything for me, he said quietly. I'm not worth that. Julian leaned forward, his voice fierce. Don't say that. You're worth more than you know. He reached for Ethan's hand under the table, hidden from view. The touch was fleeting, but it anchored Ethan, a reminder of what they were fighting for. They left the diner separately, the night air heavy with unspoken promises. Ethan walked home, his mind a battlefield of hope and fear. He wanted Julian, wanted us, but the world seemed determined to tear them apart. As he unlocked his apartment door, his phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. His blood ran cold. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Ethan stared at the text, the words "be careful who you trust" searing into his brain. His apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage. He didn't sleep, his mind spinning with questions. Who sent it? Sarah. Julian's sister. Someone else entirely. At work, he was a ghost, moving through tasks with mechanical precision. Julian was in meetings all day, unreachable, and the absence left Ethan exposed. He avoided Sarah's gaze, but her presence was a shadow, her clipboard a weapon. By midday, he couldn't take it anymore. He texted Julian, "We need to talk. Now." Julian replied instantly, My place. 8 p.m. Ethan's stomach twisted. Going to Julian's apartment felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. But he needed answers. Needed to know they were in this together. Julian's apartment was in Lincoln Park, a sleek high-rise that screamed wealth. Ethan felt out of place in his faded jacket. But when Julian opened the door, his smile was warm, unguarded. "You made it," he said, pulling Ethan inside. The apartment was all glass and steel, a stark contrast to Ethan's cluttered space. They sat on a leather couch, a bottle of wine between them, but neither drank. "I got a text last night," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Anonymous. It said to be careful who I trust." Julian's face darkened. "Show me." Ethan handed over his phone, and Julian's jaw clenched as he read the message. "This is my father's style. He doesn't confront directly, plant seeds. Makes you doubt." Ethan's heart sank. So he knows. Not everything. But he suspects I'm not following his script. Julian set the phone down, his hand brushing Ethan's. "I'm sorry you're caught in this." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not caught. I chose this. I chose you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Raw and true. Julian's eyes softened. And for a moment, the fear receded. They kissed. Slower this time. The urgency tempered by something deeper, trust. Maybe. Or the beginnings of love. But the moment shattered when Julian's phone rang. He ignored it. But the buzzing persisted. A relentless reminder of the world outside. "It's my sister again," he said, his voice heavy. He answered. His tone clipped. And Ethan caught the edge of an argument, something about a family dinner. A confrontation. When Julian hung up, he looked defeated. "They want me at the house tomorrow night. My father. My sister. The whole damn board. They're circling." Ethan reached for his hand. "Then we face it together. No more hiding." Julian laughed. A bitter sound. "You don't know my father. He'll destroy your job, my career, everything." "Then we fight," Ethan said, his voice fierce. "We're not kids. We're not powerless." He didn't know where the words came from, but they felt right, like a fire kindling inside him. Julian nodded, his resolve hardening. "Okay." Together. They spent the night talking, planning, their voices low as the city hummed outside. They didn't sleep together, not yet, but the closeness was enough. A lifeline in the storm. The next day, Ethan felt the weight of their decision. The office was a pressure cooker. Whispers now audible. Eyes tracking his every move. Sarah called him in again. This time with a warning. "Be careful. Ethan. People are talking." Her tone was almost kind, but her eyes were cold. Calculating. He left her office shaken but determined. He found Julian in the break room, their eyes meeting in a silent pact. "Tonight," Julian said, "we'll deal with my family. Then we figure out what's next." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't know if they could win, but for the first time, he felt ready to fight for Julian, for himself, for the life they might build. As he returned to his desk, another text came through. This one from Julian. "I'm with you. No matter what." Ethan clung to those words. A beacon in the gathering dark. The Hayes family estate loomed like a fortress, all stone and glass on the outskirts of Chicago. Ethan sat in Julian's car, his hands clenched in his lap as they pulled into the driveway. He'd insisted on coming, despite Julian's protests. "If we're doing this, we're doing it together," he'd said, and Julian hadn't argued. Inside, the air was thick with old money chandeliers, mahogany, portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Julian's father, Richard Hayes, waited in the dining room, his presence commanding even in silence. His sister, Emily, stood nearby, her expression unreadable. The board members, a handful of gray-suited men, sat like judges at a trial. "Julian," Richard said, his voice cold. "You've been avoiding me." Julian stood tall, his hand brushing Ethan's for a fleeting moment. "I'm here now. Let's talk." Richard's eyes flicked to Ethan, sharp and assessing. "And you brought a colleague." "Ethan's more than that," Julian said, his voice steady. The room stilled, the weight of his words sinking in. Ethan's heart raced, but he held his ground, meeting Richard's gaze. Emily stepped forward, her voice soft but cutting. "Julian, what are you doing? This isn't just about you. It's the family. The company." "I'm done living for the company," Julian interrupted. "I'm gay, Dad. I've been hiding it my whole life because of you. Because of this." He gestured at the room. "The legacy. The expectations. Ethan's the first person who's made me want to stop hiding." The silence was deafening. Richard's face hardened, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can throw away everything for this? You'll ruin yourself. Julian. And him." Ethan spoke before he could stop himself. "I don't care about your money or your power. Julian's worth more than that. We're worth more." Richard's eyes narrowed, but Emily's expression softened. Just for a moment. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their silence a judgment in itself. "You're making a mistake," Richard said, his voice like ice. "You'll lose everything: your position, your inheritance, your name." "Then I'll build something new," Julian said, his voice unwavering. Ethan felt a surge of pride, mixed with fear. This was a line they couldn't uncross. The dinner dissolved into chaos, Richard's voice rising, Emily pleading for calm. Ethan and Julian left under a cloud of threats, Richard's final words echoing, "You'll regret this." In the car, Julian was quiet, his hands tight on the wheel. Ethan reached for him, their fingers interlocking. "You okay?" he asked. "No," Julian admitted. "But I will be. Because of you." They drove to Ethan's apartment, the city a blur outside. Inside, they collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the night pressing down. Julian's voice was raw when he spoke. "I meant what I said back there. I'm done hiding. But I'm scared. Ethan, I don't know what's next." Ethan pulled him close, their foreheads touching. "We'll figure it out. Together." They kissed, not with the urgency of that first night, but with a quiet certainty, a promise to face whatever came. The next day at work, the fallout began. Whispers turned to open stares, and Sarah's performance review took a darker turn. She handed Ethan a warning letter, citing unprofessional conduct. Julian, meanwhile, was called to an emergency board meeting. Ethan waited, his nerves frayed, knowing the fight was far from over. The office was a battlefield, and Ethan was losing ground. Sarah's warning letter sat heavy in his pocket, its words unprofessional conduct burning like a brand. He kept his head down, but the stares followed him, colleagues' whispers cutting sharper than any knife. Julian was still in the board meeting, and the silence from his office was deafening. By noon, Julian emerged, his face pale but resolute. He caught Ethan's eye and nodded toward the break room. They slipped inside, closing the door against prying eyes. "They're suspending me," Julian said, his voice low. "Pending an investigation. My father's pushing for termination." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Because of us?" Julian nodded. "They're calling it a conflict of interest. But it's personal. My father wants me gone." Ethan's hands clenched. And me. Sarah's already got me on a leash. Julian's eyes darkened. I won't let them touch you. I'm fighting this. Ethan. I've got a lawyer. Someone outside the company's influence. We're not done. Ethan wanted to believe him, but fear was a living thing inside him. He'd fought so hard to build this life, his job, his independence, his fragile sense of self. Losing it now, because of love, felt like a cruel twist. But Julian's hand found his, grounding him. We're in this together, Julian said, and Ethan clung to those words. They parted with a plan: lay low, gather evidence, and fight back. Ethan spent the day combing through company policies, looking for anything to counter Sarah's accusations. Julian met with his lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel who specialized in workplace discrimination. She was optimistic but blunt. You've got a case, but it's messy. Be ready for a fight. That night, they met at a quiet park, far from the office's reach. The air was crisp, the stars hidden by city lights. Julian looked worn but determined, his hand finding Ethan's as they sat on a bench. Rachel thinks we can sue for wrongful termination if it comes to that, he said. But it'll be ugly. My family won't back down. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I'm scared, Julian. Not just about the job. About us. What if we're not strong enough for this? Julian's grip tightened. We are. I've never felt this sure about anything. You're not just a fling, Ethan. You're everything. The words broke something open in Ethan, a flood of warmth and fear. He kissed Julian, not caring who might see. For the first time, he felt the weight of love outweigh the fear of loss. They stayed in the park until midnight, planning their next steps, their voices low but fierce. The next day, the office was a pressure cooker. Sarah called Ethan in again, this time with a termination notice. You violated company policy, she said, her voice cold. Relationships with superiors are grounds for dismissal. Ethan's blood boiled. You mean relationships you don't approve of? He shot back. This isn't about policy. It's about Julian's father. Sarah's eyes flickered, but she didn't deny it. Pack your things, she said. You're done. Ethan left her office, his hands shaking. He found Julian in the parking lot, his face a storm of anger and guilt. I'm so sorry, Julian said, pulling him close. This is my fault. No, Ethan said, his voice fierce. This is their fault, and we're not letting them win. They drove to Rachel's office, laying out their case. Rachel was methodical, her questions sharp but kind. You've got a shot, she said, but you need to be ready for the fallout. This won't just be a legal fight, it'll be personal. Ethan and Julian nodded, their hands clasped under the table. They were scared, but they were together, and that was enough for now. The courtroom was a sterile box, all wood paneling and fluorescent lights. But to Ethan, it felt like a coliseum. He sat beside Julian, their hands hidden but close, as Rachel faced the judge. The lawsuit, wrongful termination. Discrimination had consumed their lives for months. Today was the final hearing, the moment they'd fought for. The past months had been brutal. Ethan had lost his job, his savings dwindling as he took freelance work to survive. Julian had been stripped of his title, his family's name a weapon turned against him. Richard Hayes had pulled every string, leaking stories to the press, painting Julian as reckless, Ethan as a gold digger. But they'd fought back, with Rachel's help, gathering evidence of biased policies and targeted harassment. In the courtroom, Rachel was a force, her voice steady as she laid out their case. She presented emails, witness statements, even Sarah's own memos, exposing the company's vendetta. Ethan testified, his voice shaking but clear, recounting the late-night kiss, the threats, the anonymous texts. Julian followed, his words raw as he spoke of his family's pressure, his fear, and his love for Ethan. The judge listened, her face unreadable. Richard sat in the back, his presence a cold weight. Emily was there too, her expression conflicted, a silent ally who'd started to question her father's crusade. When the verdict came, it was a quiet victory. The judge ruled in their favor: reinstatement, damages, a public apology from the company. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Ethan and Julian left the courthouse hand in hand, the Chicago skyline a backdrop to their triumph. They moved to a new apartment, a small but bright space in Andersonville, far from the Hayes estate and the office's shadow. Julian started a consulting firm, free from his father's control. Ethan found work with a nonprofit, advocating for workplace equality. Their lives weren't perfect, money was tight, and the scars of the fight lingered, but they were together, building something new. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, the city alive below, Julian turned to Ethan. "I'd do it all again," he said, his voice soft. "Every fight, every loss, for you." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "Me too." They kissed, the world fading away. And for the first time, Ethan felt truly free, not just from fear, but to love, to live, to be himself. Their story wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing each other, against all odds, and finding a home in the space between them. The office, the locked door, the threats, they were a beginning, not an end. And as the city lights flickered, Ethan knew they'd write the rest of their story together, one brave step at a time.